As you can see from the title and thumbnail of this video, I think Alexander Rakic and Mackenzie Dern are great value bets this weekend, so make sure you stick around, watch the entire video to understand the reasons why. I'm going to be going into a lot of detail on both of those fights, including some video footage of why I think Dern and Rakic are very likely to win, and hopefully they can help us earn some extra cash this weekend. We've been doing pretty well on the bets that I've been sharing with you guys on YouTube. You can see on the last event that I did a video for, I bet Jandiroba and Charles Oliveira. We ended up going 1-1 on those bets. Denise obviously struggled very badly, but Oliveira looked great. And with both guys in the even money odds range, it was about break even on those two bets. But going a little bit further back, we can see I also recommended a bet on Max Holloway to beat Dustin Poirier. And he came through for us in a big way. And then before that, we had a very nice big underdog bet on Derek Lewis to beat Taliesin Teixeira, and he came through for us. So we've been doing all right on these YouTube bets, and hopefully we can do really good if Dern and Rakic come through for us, and I'm very confident they will. It's been a while since I felt really confident on two pre-fight bets, but I feel very confident Dern and Rakic are going to get the job done this weekend. They've got really good stylistic matchups ahead of them against Murzakanov and also obviously Jandiroba respectively. So we're going to get into these fights shortly. Just want to let you guys know that we're on absolute fire in the live betting group. So if you're not a part of my live betting group, I really don't understand the reason why. You can see over our 10-year history since we've been tracking results, we've made a profit the vast majority of events. We actually make a profit in 74% of months. So it's an absolute no-brainer to join us. It pays for itself. The membership pays for itself. You'll make money betting on the UFC, on the sport you love, most months, and I think you'll find it incredibly entertaining as well. This group, over the long term, has performed exceptionally well, and collectively we've made millions and millions and millions of dollars in profit as a group. And I'm going to be dramatically improving this service very soon, and when I do that, I think spaces are going to fill up very, very quickly. There's only 50 spaces in the live betting group, and what you tend to find is for months and months and years, this group is often fully packed out and you can't get a space and have to do waiting list systems and all that kind of stuff. I've had spaces for a long time now just because the website, the platform hasn't been as good as it should be, but making improvements in that area shortly, and when I do, I think spaces are going to fill up really quick. So if I were you, I would take a look at the live betting group. I would give it a try, because pretty soon this might be very difficult to join, very difficult to get on board with, and to be honest with you, you're going to be missing out on a huge opportunity if you're not in the group, because like I say, it's a relatively low cost for how much profit you can earn live betting on the UFC, and you're essentially getting paid to bet on the sport and make money on the sport you love. So it's an absolute no-brainer to join. I don't usually talk like this, but I don't understand why there are spaces. Give it a try. You will not regret it. I promise you that. We're on fire, boys. So let's get into the first fight that we're going to be talking about on this card, which is going to be the main event between Tom Aspinall and Cyril Gane. So we're going to start off with a fighter comparison tool. As you can see, we've also launched this fantastic new UFC Research Tool that you've all got access to. All you need to do is go to my website, MMABettingTips.com. I'll actually leave a link to the research tool in the description below if you want to play around with it and take a look at it. And if you come to the website and you want to know where to find it, just roll the mouse over tools and you'll see the UFC Research Tool here, as well as tons of new features that are coming over the next few weeks as we deploy this brand new website that I've been building for us. So the Research Tool is now live. If you're watching on YouTube, link in the description below. If you're watching this on the website, you're already using it. So here we go into the main event. So we can see age, bit of a nothing burger between these two. Aspinall, a little bit taller, but Gane has got the 3-inch reach advantage. Aspinall, slight leg reach advantage. I think size, age in this one is a bit of a nothing burger. Now, in terms of the stats comparison between the two, you can see that Aspinall actually lands 50% more strikes per minute than Gane, which is a huge edge. But obviously, the question with Aspinall is whether he can maintain that output over a 25-minute period. Obviously, we've never seen him go into the third round in his entire career. He's only been past the second round 3 times in his career. So even though he lands 50% more strikes per minute, obviously that's all for the most part first round finishes. 5.26 strikes landed per minute for Gane, with how many fights he's been to a decision in, is actually really impressive and way above average for a heavyweight. So that actually, even though the stat favours Aspinall in this one, it's quite impressive from Gane, because I don't think Aspinall can keep this up, for the full 25-minute period. He's a big guy. In terms of accuracy, they're about the same. In terms of defense, they're about the same. Obviously, Aspinall is a much more well-rounded fighter than Gane, who is just a pure, he's just a pure striker, really. So no surprise to see Aspinall with the advantage when it comes to takedowns. And we could see that Cyril Gane doesn't have 56% better takedown offense. He actually has 56% worse takedown offense. It's a bug I'm going to have to fix. That's why doing these videos, using this, is very useful, as you get to learn little quirks for the system that needs to be improved. I'll fix that for the next event. I think the system is getting confused here, but we'll sort that out. Obviously, 100% takedown offense for Aspinall and 44% takedown offense for Gane is very, very poor. And grappling, as we know, is a huge issue with Cyril Gane that could get him into a lot of trouble in this one. Aspinall far more likely to attempt submissions in 15-minute periods as well, which is a bit of a surprise with how often you see Cyril Gane roll for random leg locks. He did it in his fight against Volkov, which cost him. And he also did it against Francis Ngannou, which cost him being the UFC heavyweight champion. He was on his way to beating Ngannou until he started rolling for legs and doing all kinds of crazy shit. In terms of the strike distribution heat map, we can see that Aspinall very much headhunts. 82% of his strikes are targeted towards the head. He's got big knockout power, so it's no surprise. Whereas we know Cyril Gane likes to mix things up, throw a lot of range-finding kicks, and so his distribution is far more spread out, where he attacks the legs and the bodies far more than Tom Aspinall does. And so, yes, that's how the stats and the tail of the tape look. How do these two match up from a stylistic point of view, and how should we consider this one from a betting point of view? Well, you guys know me. I always talk about how it's very important that we let the odds do the work for us. And I think when you look at the odds on these two guys, it's just an absolute no-brainer that if you want to bet this fight, you take Cyril Gane. Tom Aspinall's a 1.25 favourite, which is minus 400 for an implied probability of 80%. And Cyril Gane, 3.99 underdog, which is going to be plus 299 for an implied probability of 25%. Whilst I think it's far more likely Tom Aspinall will win this weekend, who to bet in this fight really is an IQ test. Because when we consider what we know about Tom Aspinall, even though this weekend will be his 10th fight in the UFC, he's pretty much a complete unknown. If we take a look at his record, we can see that the vast majority of his career fights have ended in round 1. And we can see that, in his 9 fights in the UFC so far, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 of them, so 8 of his 9 fights in the UFC so far have ended in round 1. The only fight that went past round 1 was against a 40-year-old Andrei Arlovski, and the fight ended just a minute into round 2, so it was literally a 6-minute long fight. And what's also interesting, if we look at all these first round finishes in the UFC, they were very quick first round finishes, so 45 seconds, a minute and a half, 2.5 minutes, 15 seconds this fight ended in, minute and 13, minute and 9 seconds, and a minute flat against Curtis Blades. So ultimately what all of this means is that we really don't know very much about Tom Aspinall, which is crazy, right? Because he's become one of the most popular fighters in the UFC. He's got the UK riding on his back. He's being promoted. There's been a lot of media attention with him and the drama around John Jones. He's the interim champion, and there's a lot of hype behind him, and he's a big favourite against Cyril Gane. And everyone's talking about how he can be the next big star in the heavyweight division. But ultimately, we don't know very much about him. And one of the things that I've learned in my very long and very profitable career is that you should never make assumptions about a fighter's strengths or weaknesses until they display them in the octagon. We should only be making betting decisions based on what we've actually seen, and assumption ultimately is the mother of all fuck-ups. How often do we see situations where these fighters, Peyton Talbot's a great example. There's all these hype behind them. They're going to be the next big thing, the next champion. They're incredible. And then we see them tested for the first time in an area we've never seen them tested in before, and they look very average. And all of a sudden, their capabilities kind of get exposed. I'm not saying that'll happen with Tom Aspinall this weekend, because you've got to be radically open-minded. While we can be cautious with someone like Aspinall that has a lot of unanswered questions over them, and we can, not get, swept up in the hype train and he'll get carried away with his capabilities. We've also got to be open-minded to the fact that he could actually be the greatest heavyweight of all time, because he's certainly a lot faster, and moves a lot better than almost any other heavyweight I've ever seen. So he could actually be just as good as people have hyped him up to be. But the issue with Tom Aspinall from a betting point of view is all this hype and kind of like the guy that the UFC hype machine are expecting him to be is what the odds are representing. The odds are not representing the reality of where Tom Aspinall's at in his career. The odds are representing the public perception of how good Tom Aspinall is. And the reality is he's quite inexperienced. Yes, he's had 18 fights, but he's barely spent any time in the octagon. For context, Cyril Gane, in his decision against, in his decision against Francis Ngannou, one fight, he has spent more time in the octagon than Tom Aspinall's 9 UFC fights combined. So if you think about it, Aspinall is very inexperienced. He's obviously, extremely dangerous in the first round, and he's fast and technical and has true legit knockout power, and he's incredible for one round. But my question is, how does he look in round 2? How does he look in round 3? How does he look in round 4? How does he look in round 5? How does his gas tank hold up? How does he look if he's put on his back? How does he look when he gets hurt? How does he look when he faces adversity? There are so many unanswered questions over him. And we know, generally speaking, heavyweights tend to slow down as fights progress. Heavyweights, a lot of heavyweights do tend to have cardio issues. Yes, you get the odd unicorns like the Junior Dos Santoses, the Cain Velasquez's, the Cyril Ganes, the Francis Ngannou's, who have tremendous cardio. And perhaps you could put Tom Aspinall into those group of fighters that is one of these next-gen heavyweights that, has the cardio and athletic capabilities of a fighter in a much lower weight class. But again, assumption's the mother of all fuck-ups. And until we actually see Aspinall prove that he can go 2 hard rounds, 3 hard rounds, 4 hard rounds, even 5 hard rounds, is very dangerous at an implied probability to assume that Aspinall can go 5 hard rounds with Cyril Gane, because the reality is that Cyril Gane's battle tested. And so while Cyril Gane does have a lot of issues and plenty of weaknesses that Aspinall can potentially exploit, sometimes better the devil you know. And for me personally, from a betting point of view, it's a much more intelligent, safer and smarter move to take Gane at an implied probability of 25% over Aspinall at an implied probability of 80%, because in order to be profitable betting on guys in Aspinall's odds range, you need to maintain a long-term win rate of 85%, which is very difficult to do. In order to be profitable on fighters in Aspinall's odds range, you need to win 9 out of 10 bets. And every time you lose one bet, you gotta win a ton more bets just to get back to break even. And for me, that's a very difficult path to walk. The only time I would ever consider betting guys in this odds range is when they have no unanswered questions and virtually no way to lose. And that just isn't the case here with the fact that he's barely been outside of the first round in his career. And we know Ciryl Gane, for all of his weaknesses, has the cardio to go hard for 25 minutes. He's got some of the best cardio in the division. So now that we've got that out of the way, we could talk about how these two match up from a technical point of view. And when we do that, it's very important to remember that we can talk with a lot of confidence and conviction in Ciryl Gane's strengths and weaknesses, because we've seen so much of him in the octagon. With Tom Aspinall, all we can really do is judge him on those very short, fleeting moments in the octagon, which don't last very long. And look, I'm very aware that this breakdown may make it sound like I'm being critical of Tom Aspinall or being harsh towards him, and I really don't want to come across like that at all, because ultimately Aspinall, when guys like me talk about him in this context, he's a victim of his own success, right? He's so damn good that he just smokes anyone that the UFC put in front of him. So, you know, he's brilliant from what we've seen of him, right? He's a victim of his own success. What I'm just saying is, to make assumptions about how he's going to look in rounds 2, 3, 4, and 5 against a guy like Gane is a dangerous game to play at an implied probability of 80%. If these guys were in the even money odds range, I would bet Aspinall all day long, but they're not, and you've got to let the odds do the work for you. Even if you're Tom Aspinall's mum, you've got to bet Ciryl Gane at these odds if you want to bet this fight, because there's just no upside in betting Tom Aspinall at all at such big of a favourite, with so many unanswered questions surrounding him. So let's talk about how they match up from striking to grappling and everything in between. So we'll focus first of all on the grappling, which is probably the easiest area to break down. There's just no dressing it up. There's no way of sugarcoating it. Ciryl Gane's grappling is horrendous. Now, his takedown offense isn't great either. We saw the stat on the fighter comparison tool. 44% takedown offense is pretty abysmal. It's not terrible, it's pretty abysmal. And the thing about Gane, he's just a very low level on the ground. He makes a lot of mistakes on the ground. He gives up position. He commits too hard to long shot submissions that he's really got no chance of getting. I mean, these cost him against Francis Ngannou. And so, on the ground, based on what we've seen, Aspinall is levels and levels and levels above Ciryl Gane. Now, even though from a technical point of view, there's no doubt that Aspinall has a huge advantage when it comes to grappling, it is worth noting that particularly for big guys, grappling is often the fastest way that a fighter is going to gas themselves out, particularly if they've already kind of got poor cardio. It's the main reason why we bet Charles Oliveira to beat Mateusz Gamrot. We know that Gamrot tends to slow down in fights, and we know that Charles Oliveira had the technical capabilities to make him work very hard in grappling positions. Even if Gamrot were potentially to win those grappling positions, we knew that Oliveira would still be able to make him work very, very hard on the ground, which would accelerate the rate at which Gamrot burnt through energy. And so in a matchup like this, even though from a technical point of view, Aspinall does undoubtedly have the advantage on the ground, we can even say that with confidence and conviction based on the very limited amount of footage we've got on him. But we know that Gane is so bad on the ground that Aspinall by default will be better than him. The problem is Gane's cardio is really good for a heavyweight, and that can close the skill gap, because if these two do start mixing it up on the ground and Aspinall doesn't get the submission, that grappling may tire Aspinall out a lot, which could then actually enable Gane to have a little bit of success on the ground, or more success than we would anticipate. So cardio is a huge factor in this one. Now, when it comes to striking, they've got a lot of similarities when it comes to striking, but also a lot of differences. The main similarity that you see from both of these guys is that they move like fighters in far lower weight classes, and I say that as a huge compliment. We know, generally speaking, the technical capabilities of fighters in the heavyweight division is pretty bad. It's a flat-footed, slow, low-level, stuck in the mud division. But both Aspinall and Gane are these next-generation MMA fighters who move well, and they're technical, and they've got great footwork, and they're just very skilled fighters. They're both very light on their feet. They both use a lot of movement. They're both pretty good defensively. They're great. They're both really, really great on the feet. The main difference between these two, and we can see this again in the fighter comparison tool if we look at the strike distribution heat map, is that Aspinall's got this big power, this huge speed, and that ability to spring forward, cover distance very quickly, and catch guys with fight-ending strikes. Whereas Cyril Gane likes to stay behind the jab and his rangy kicking game to just chip away at you from a safe distance. And that's why we can see on the strike distribution chart, Aspinall very much targets the head because he's either all the way outside of a range where he can be hit, or springing forward, blitzing forward on you, trying to take you out with those big knockout shots. Whereas Gane's happy to, again, just stay slightly outside of a range where he can be hit, but just chip away at you with those leg and body kicks to rack up volume. They're not going to hurt you a whole lot, but they're going to disrupt your rhythm. They're gonna rack up big volume and outpoint you and make it very, very difficult for you to land more than him, you know, in a round, because of how active and busy he is. His volume's great. I mean, landing over 5 strikes on average per minute for a heavyweight is pretty special, and I don't think Gane gets enough credit for that. So when you look at how they match up from a technical point of view, what's interesting about this one is that Aspinall's had a lot of success using his speed to cover distance quickly and knock out these lower level, slow, flat-footed heavyweights. But Gane's very technical, very good defensively. It'll be interesting to see if Aspinall has as much success with his striking against someone, you know, equally skilled on the feet, should we say. Not as powerful, but certainly as technical. So it's a very, very, very interesting fight between these two. I've kind of already summarized how I feel about it from a betting point of view. I don't think it'll come as a shock to anyone that this is dog or pass Cyril Gane. There's no way you can bet Aspinall at these odds, but I'm really, really hoping that you found that breakdown useful. And if you are planning on betting this fight this weekend, the very best of luck to you. We will have a very quick look at the over/under and the prop bets and all that kind of stuff. You can see that the over 1.5 rounds is actually set at 1.83. I actually really, really like a bet on the over 1.5 rounds. I might take that. I think that both of these guys understand how huge of an opportunity this is to become the heavyweight champion of the UFC. It's a pretty big deal. And whilst the majority of Aspinall's fights end very, very quickly, Gane has shown us that he's durable. We saw that in the Tai Tuivasa fight. He's shown us that, you know, he's pretty tough. Again, he showed that in the Tuivasa and the Ngannou fight. He's very good defensively. He moves well. And I just think we may see a slightly less aggressive version of Aspinall early in this fight, because surely he's going to be thinking, you know, 25 minutes is a long time. I need to be pacing myself. I can't go out there trying to kill this guy in round 1 and risk gassing myself out. I need to pace myself, maybe start a little slower. So do quite like the over 1.5 rounds. I haven't decided if I'll bet it yet, but it might be something you want to think about. And in terms of the prop bets, let's take a look at what Cyril Gane by decision is. So Cyril Gane by decision would be 8.0 to 10.0 depending on what site you've got. You guys know my perspective on prop bets. I like to go for not necessarily the most likely outcome, because the odds on that are always going to be short. But I do like to go for kind of like those longer shot props, which do actually have a realistic chance of winning at big juicy odds. Yes, your win rate is going to be quite low on bets like that, but at odds of 10.0 plus 900, you don't need to win bets like that very often to be profitable long term. So Gane by decision is interesting to me. What about Gane by knockout or TKO in the 3rd, the 4th? Yeah, so these are the kind of bets I like. So Gane wins in round 3, anywhere from 19.0 to 26.0. I mean, if you can bet Gane to win in round 3 at plus 2,500, I like that a lot. Plus 3,300 to win in round 4, and same odds for him to win in round 5. I love those kind of bets because you are kind of betting on the potential that Aspinall's cardio is bad, which is a very real possibility. And if his cardio is bad, then this could be a very, very tough night for him. So I really, really like those odds on those props. Something for you to consider, and I hope you found that useful. Now I'm going to explain the reason why I think Mackenzie Dern to beat Virna Jandiroba is a fantastic bet this weekend. And as ever, we're going to kick things off by taking a look at the fighter comparison tool. Now, every single person watching this video has got access to this fighter comparison tool. If you're watching on YouTube, I'll leave a link to it in the description below. And if you're on the website, all you need to do to find it is go to tools in the nav bar, and you'll see the UFC Research Tool here, as well as a bunch of other features that I've got coming to the website over the next few weeks, which I'm very, very excited for you to start using and getting value out of. So let's take a look through the fighter comparison, where we start to see just some of the edges for Mackenzie Dern in this fight before we even get into considering how these two match up from a stylistic point of view. So we can see first of all that Mackenzie Dern is 5 years younger, and at this stage in their careers, that's absolutely huge. Virna Jandiroba, she's 37 years old, which is very, very old for the lighter weight classes, whereas Mackenzie Dern at 32 years old, she's in her prime and should still be improving from fight to fight. So statistically, the younger fighter wins around 65% of the time when there's a 5-year age gap in a fight. However, if you were to measure how often 32-year-olds beat 37-year-olds, I would imagine the stat would be far greater than 65%, because obviously the 5-year age gap is an average across all ages, right? It's when you see 30-year-olds fight 25-year-olds, 35-year-olds fight 30-year-olds. This stat and the power of this stat really reflects that, you know, when you're in your late 30s, 40s, whatever, and you're facing fighters in their prime, you know, early 30s, mid 30s, the older fighter loses a high percentage of the time. So straight away, that's a big edge for Mackenzie Dern. We can also see she's a little bit taller, kind of negligible, balanced out by the fact that Jandiroba has a 1-inch reach advantage. They've both got the same leg reach. Now, in the stats is where things start to get really, really, really interesting, particularly strikes landed per minute, because both these girls are obviously primarily grapplers. You'd expect to see a lot of grappling in this fight, but one area where I think Mackenzie Dern has a huge advantage is when it comes to striking. Now, it is true that in their first fight a few years ago, Jandiroba did outstrike Dern. She inflicted a lot of damage on her, you know, crushed her nose, broke her nose really bad. But since then, Mackenzie Dern has made exponential improvements to her striking. And we can see that the fight against Jandiroba was a very long time ago. It was back in 2020. A lot can change in 5 years. Mackenzie Dern has improved her striking so much in that time. And you've got to think, you know, 5 years ago, Jandiroba would have been 32 years old. She would have been in her prime. She would have been at the stage in her career that Mackenzie Dern is at now. But whilst Mackenzie Dern has had 5 years of improvement between the ages of 27 to 32, Jandiroba will have started to decline between the ages of 32 to 37. So both these girls, since their first fight back in 2020, have been on opposite career trajectories, and that's just normal, that's just biology, that's just the way it goes. So the striking stats are super interesting because it shows that Mackenzie Dern actually lands 68% more strikes per minute than Jandiroba, which is huge. That is a huge edge, and it's going to be very, very difficult for Jandiroba to close that statistical gap, especially because Jandiroba has a tendency to slow down a lot as fights wear on, whereas Mackenzie Dern fights at a very high pace. She's a cardio machine. She can go hard for 5 rounds, no problem. And so even though neither of these girls are particularly technical on the feet or skilled on the feet, ultimately Dern is the fighter with higher output. She works harder, and what the strikes per minute statistic really shows is in those periods of the fight where there isn't grappling and they are standing and striking, just through sheer volume alone, Mackenzie Dern should be winning the stand-up exchanges, and that does give her a very, very big edge in this fight, because from my perspective, with how high level both these girls are on the ground, it's very, very unlikely that Jandiroba is going to be able to submit Dern, which means if it gets to the point where Jandiroba is too tired to take Dern down and she's forced to stand and strike, it's going to be all Dern based on this stat. Now, in terms of accuracy, they're both painfully inaccurate. 40% accuracy on strikes is extremely poor, but they're both primarily grapplers, and you kind of expect it, right? In terms of striking defense, you can see that Jandiroba is slightly better defensively, which isn't a big surprise because Dern has a tendency to come forward with a lot of pressure, a lot of aggression, and block punches with her face. We know Dern's very bad defensively, but she's extremely tough, extremely durable. We've seen her in some absolute wars and take a lot of damage and fight through it. The first fight back in 2020, great example of that, when Dern took an enormous amount of damage to her nose in that second round, pushed through and still found a way to get the win. In terms of takedowns per 15 minutes, you can see that favours Jandiroba. Not a huge surprise. Dern's offensive wrestling has never been the best. She does have a base in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. She's never quite connected the dots between, the stand-up and getting fights to the ground with her wrestling. Jandiroba's far better at that. Jandiroba's got good takedown entries, good offensive wrestling, decent chain wrestling, but I don't really think it matters that much in the context of this fight, and I'll explain why when we get into the kind of the nitty-gritty of the grappling between these two. So in terms of takedown offense, you can see Jandiroba has a huge advantage here, 49% better takedown offense than Mackenzie Dern. Again, I don't really think it's that relevant to this fight. 25% takedown offense is, of course, terrible, but Mackenzie Dern is a bit of a unicorn, and perhaps maybe the only fighter in the UFC where having bad takedown offense is not only intentional but also potentially a good thing, because Dern's not even trying to defend takedowns. Her ground game is at such a high level that she wants you to take her down because she is an utter demon on the ground. And quite frankly, I think Mackenzie Dern is one of the highest level Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu practitioners we've ever had in the sport. I think she's unbelievable, and so she doesn't even bother trying to defend takedowns. Good luck if you do choose to take her down, because she'll drag you through hell on the ground. And whilst I'm sure Jandiroba may have the edge because she's a little bit more physically imposing early on, I think if these two start mixing it up on the ground and it goes into rounds 2, 3, 4 and 5, I think it'll reach a point where Dern absolutely drowns Jandiroba with grappling. And we haven't seen anyone do that to Jandiroba on the ground before, but there's levels to the game, and I think Dern is just operating at a totally different level to Jandiroba. We may not always get to see it because Jandiroba's physicality makes up for some of her issues on the ground, but I think she's going to need a lot more physicality to survive on the ground against Dern for 25 minutes. We can see both girls are pretty aggressive by average standards in terms of attempting submissions in a 15-minute period. Jandiroba has the slight edge. Now, in terms of strike distribution, neither girl really bothers going to the body or the head, and the majority of these body and leg strikes landed are going to be from within the clinch. You can see that they both very, very much favour head strikes, which is no surprise. It's generally what you see from lower level strikers. Only when you get to the high level dudes who know how to mix it up, like a Cyril Gane, you see that more even distribution of strikes landed. And the heat map is beautiful for showing kind of the limitations of both these girls on the feet. So we've already, throughout that stats comparison, done a pretty good job of explaining how both these girls match up in terms of striking and in terms of grappling. And from the numbers, it is quite clear that Mackenzie Dern has a big advantage on the feet. Jandiroba has more raw power for sure. She is better defensively. But over a 25-minute period, with how much Jandiroba slows down and how much Dern's striking has improved since their first fight, I just don't see how Jandiroba is going to be able to compete on the feet with Mackenzie Dern. So at this point, before we really get into the weeds of the grappling, we have two big reasons to bet on Mackenzie Dern in this fight. In fact, we have three big reasons. The first reason is Mackenzie Dern's younger. Jandiroba at 37 is pretty old, and she's going to be declining from fight to fight. The second reason, we know Dern's got the advantage on the feet, not only from a technical point of view, but in terms of output and volume as well. And the third reason, it's absolutely undeniable, that Dern has a huge advantage when it comes to cardio. Jandiroba tends to slow down a lot as fights wear on, whereas Mackenzie Dern is an absolute cardio machine. And in a 5-round fight, Dern is going to be capable of weaponizing that cardio, pushing a crazy pace, and dragging Jandiroba into deep waters where she's going to have a very big edge. So in terms of the grappling between these two, again, during that fighter comparison discussion, we spoke about how Jandiroba is the better MMA grappler in terms of the combination of wrestling and BJJ, the more physically imposing grappler out of the two. But in the Cyril Gane versus Tom Aspinall fight, we spoke about how grappling is one of the things that is most exhausting for fighters. And it's the fastest way to burn through energy. And when you have fighters like Jandiroba or Mateusz Gamrot, who are very strong, very physically imposing grapplers, but they also slow down as fights wear on, these particular kinds of fighters find themselves in a difficult position where the one thing they're best at is also kind of like their kryptonite. And we saw this in the Gamrot versus Charles Oliveira fight. This was one of the main reasons why we bet Charles Oliveira in that fight, and why we're using the same principle to bet Mackenzie Dern in this fight. Whilst Jandiroba is a great grappler and Gamrot's a great grappler, if you make them work hard on the ground, they become very beatable and the skill gap closes. And we saw that between Gamrot and Oliveira, where by the second round, once Gamrot had started to get a little bit tired, Oliveira completely dominated Gamrot on the ground. And I'd expect to see the same thing here. The key to beating fighters like Jandiroba and Gamrot in grappling positions is that you must make them work. And when we recorded the breakdown video for the fight between Oliveira and Gamrot, and I was explaining the reasons why Charles Oliveira was such a great bet, we showed video footage of Gamrot against Dan Hooker and showed clips of Dan Hooker making Gamrot work very hard for grappling positions. So even though Gamrot was the better grappler than Hooker, the fact that Hooker made him work so hard to obtain dominant positions is the reason why Gamrot's MMA grappling then became so ineffective against Hooker in the second half of the fight. And I think you're going to get the same thing here. Early on, it's possible that Jandiroba's wrestling and physicality may be too much for Mackenzie Dern to deal with. We know that Mackenzie Dern is quite feminine, she's quite slight, she doesn't have that raw, brutish physicality that someone like Jandiroba has, but Dern makes up for that in world-class technique and cardio for days. She sacrifices that brutish physicality for the cardio. And Dern, just like Charles Oliveira, can make you work extremely hard on the ground. So if you're in a dominant position, if you're on her back or if you're on top of her, she's going to be constantly attacking with submissions, constantly trying to improve her position, constantly trying to create scrambles to improve the situation she's in. And Jandiroba is going to have to react to that and exert energy to shut that down and deal with it. And the more Dern tries to attack submissions, tries to improve her position, the more energy Jandiroba is going to burn, and ultimately the faster she's going to get tired. So I think Mackenzie Dern is an absolutely brilliant bet in this fight. You can see her odds at the moment, 1.65, which is minus 154 for an implied probability of 60%. I'd cap Dern as high as 70 to 75% in this fight, because from my perspective, in a fight like this, you've got to consider all the ways in which Jandiroba could win. How likely is it that she would finish Dern? Not very likely in my opinion. It's going to be Very, very difficult to submit Dern. I'm not going to say impossible, nothing's impossible, but very, very difficult. We've seen Dern grapple with, some of the best female grapplers in the world, like Fionn Davis, and they haven't been able to submit her. Jandiroba just isn't on that level. We know Dern's incredibly tough and durable. Jandiroba's not that dangerous on the feet, so the chances of a knockout aren't that likely. So then you've really got to question, what are the chances that Jandiroba could win a decision? Well, if she's not going to be able to outstrike Dern in terms of volume, and we know she slows down a lot as fights wear on, can she really outgrapple someone like Dern for 3 out of 5 rounds and take a decision? I think it's incredibly unlikely. That is her only path to victory, and there's not much of a realistic chance of that happening, in my opinion. So I think you're going to get a Dern win this weekend, and I think she's an absolutely fantastic bet. I'm surprised she's not a far bigger favourite. Now, if we take a look at the over-under on this one, we can see that the odds on the fight to go to decision or not are pretty much in the even money odds range. Personally, I am very tempted to bet fight ends inside the distance, just because Mackenzie Dern is one of these fighters that doesn't have to worry about pacing herself. Doesn't matter if she's fighting for 1 round, 3 rounds, 5 rounds, or 10 rounds. Dern looks just as good in the first round as she does in the 20th round. She can go hard and she never gets tired. She's a cardio machine. And as a result, she does weaponize her cardio and she comes out the gate very hard, which is the reason why she lands so many strikes on average per minute. And so I don't think Jandiroba is going to be able to keep up with the pace that Dern sets. So I think when Jandiroba starts to slow in the 3rd, 4th, 5th round, I think it's going to be very difficult for her to survive with Dern, who does have that killer instinct. And I think it's very, very likely that Dern gets a finish in the second half of the fight. So I'm very tempted to bet on the fight to end inside the distance. And what are the odds on Dern to win inside the distance? I can't imagine very good. No, they're not a whole lot better than... they're obviously double the odds of her money line, but I would prefer to go bigger on her money line than fuck about with the prop bet on her to win inside the distance, to be honest with you. And the reason why I would not take Dern by submission or knockout is because I think she could finish this fight in multiple ways. I think she could get a finish on the feet if Jandiroba becomes too tired to defend herself. I also think she could get a submission on the ground if Jandiroba gets to the point where she becomes too tired to defend herself. So, yeah, hopefully Dern comes through for us this weekend. I'm very, very confident that she will. I think the only way she doesn't win this weekend is if you get a situation where she shows up sick or injured or gets disqualified or injures herself in the fight, or we get some of that weird MMA nonsense take place. If both these girls show up, and, if both these girls show up and perform to their full potential, I think Dern wins this 9 out of 10 times. I think it's a fantastic stylistic matchup for her. And I think we're going to get a brand new champion on Saturday night who can be a new poster girl for the UFC, and they need it right now because, let's face it, they're struggling for stars. I honestly think it's been long overdue, and I think Dern's going to be the next big thing in the UFC. And I think Daddy Dana is going to have a fucking heart attack if Jandiroba wins this weekend, because I think they need some big names so they can start pumping some big events and selling some pay-per-views and getting some momentum back, and I think Dern can give them that. So I hope you found that useful. Now let's break down the next fight on this card, which is going to be Umar Nurmagomedov and Mario Bautista. So if we start off by taking a look at the odds on this one, we can see that Nurmagomedov is a 1.16 favourite, which is going to be minus 635 for an implied probability of 86%. If we take a look at the odds on Bautista, he is around about a 5.36 underdog, which is plus 436 for an implied probability of around 19%. So taking a look at the fighter comparison tool, both guys are about the same age, about the same size. The reach and leg reach virtually identical. Now let's get into the stats. We're going to quickly go over these because I don't want to spend too long on this fight, but we can see Bautista lands 40% more strikes per minute, which is great. We can see the Nurmagomedov slightly more accurate, slightly better defensively. Of course, he's far more aggressive with the takedowns than Bautista, who's more of a striker. And we can see both guys have got pretty good takedown defense, but Nurmagomedov up in that elite percentile, up towards 80%, and we can see that submission attempts per minute. Interesting that Bautista is actually a bit more aggressive. They've also got quite a similar distribution of strikes on the anatomical heat map here. Majority of the strikes of both guys going towards the head. They don't mix it up too much, and where you see these strikes landed to the body, for the most part those strikes are going to be from the clinch as opposed to on the feet. Although, to be fair to Nurmagomedov, he does land some body kicks. So this is a very, very, very difficult stylistic matchup for Mario Bautista because he's going into enemy territory. Now, Umar Nurmagomedov is not from the United Arab Emirates. Obviously, this weekend's card is taking place in Yas Island in the UAE. But Nurmagomedov is a Muslim. And a few years ago, I did a study on the statistical advantages that Muslims have in the United Arab Emirates when they face non-Muslims. And you can take a look at this study here. I will leave a link to it in the description below if you're watching this on YouTube. If you're a member of my community, just come to the research tool and you can just go to my written breakdown here and you can click into it and read it there. We'll just have a quick look. You can see that I actually did a video summarizing all the data from what I discovered. But basically what I discovered was, it won't come as any surprise to you, Muslims have a huge statistical advantage over non-Muslims in the United Arab Emirates. Now, initially I thought this may have been due to favourable matchmaking, right? Nurmagomedov is one of the best bantamweights in the division. It's always going to be difficult for a guy like Bautista to beat him, no matter where they fight. But actually, when I looked at the advantage that Muslim fighters had against non-Muslims in fights where the Muslim was either the underdog or in the even money odds range, I found they also had a huge statistical advantage. So for guys like Nurmagomedov, who already have, you know, a very favourable matchup in front of them and big stylistic advantages, a fight like this becomes extremely difficult for Bautista, because we know in the United Arab Emirates they're very biased when it comes to judging towards Muslim fighters. It's just the way it is. And look, at the end of the day, people might not like that, people might get offended by it, but you know, ultimately it's my job to make the most amount of money possible from the information that I've got available to me. And it's no different when I bet Figueiredo a few weeks ago in his fight against Montel Jackson, because he's Brazilian fighting in Brazil against a non-Brazilian. It's no different to last week when I make money betting on Ayman Zahabi because he's Canadian fighting a non-Canadian in Canada, right? Home advantage is a huge deal in sports. It's a huge deal in the UFC. And whilst, yes, Nurmagomedov's not from the United Arab Emirates, home advantage applies to Muslim fighters. The numbers don't lie. The data doesn't lie. Take a look at my study and you'll see for yourself. So the brutal reality of this matchup is, in order for Bautista to beat Nurmagomedov this weekend, he's going to either have to finish Nurmagomedov, which is extremely unlikely because Bautista's a volume striker without knockout power, and he's, you know, not the most dangerous grappler, shall we say, or he's going to have to win 2 out of the 3 rounds dominantly in order to win a decision. It won't be enough to just edge rounds against Nurmagomedov because the judging is so biased towards Muslim fighters in the United Arab Emirates that even if Bautista just edges a round, they'll more than likely still score the round for Nurmagomedov. So the probability of Bautista putting 2 out of 3 dominant rounds in the bank is so low that it's very unlikely he's going to win this weekend. You already know that Nurmagomedov is one of the best in the division, but even though Bautista is very well rounded and very skilled, it's not going to be enough for him to edge a competitive fight or edge a close fight here. He would have to dominate Nurmagomedov in order to get his hand raised, and that just isn't very realistic at all. So Nurmagomedov is going to win this a very high percentage of the time. His odds reflect that. He probably is a safe guy to throw into your parlays. Personally, I don't think there's any point in betting him, because in order to get any value here, you'd have to give him a 90% or better chance of winning, which is pretty much impossible to do in MMA. You know, with bad weight cuts, injuries, disqualifications, bad refereeing, bad judging, flash knockouts, You know, fighters fighting injured, all that kind of stuff. Very risky to bet guys in this odds range. But Nurmagomedov should get the job done. On the feet, he's very technical. He moves well, gets in and out of range very well. You know, he's got that sniper style of striking. Obviously, Nurmagomedov is a top-tier elite MMA grappler, although Bautista is very difficult to take down and hold down. This is a fight that I do actually think will be competitive. I think Bautista will hold his own here, but ultimately, Nurmagomedov is probably going to get his hand raised. So, yeah, do with that information what you will. For me, I can't bet this. Nurmagomedov is too big of a favourite, but I wouldn't be betting on a non-Muslim against a Muslim in United Arab Emirates unless they had huge advantages, which Bautista doesn't. In terms of the over-under on this one, I think it is very likely this fight will go to a decision. Both guys are decisionators. If we take a look at their records, we can see that Nurmagomedov, decision. Been to a decision in 3 of his last 4. If we take a look at Bautista, 1, 2, 3, 4. His last 4 fights have gone to a decision. So both guys tough, both well-rounded. This one will very likely go to a decision as well. Unfortunately, the odds reflect that, with fight goes to a decision being in about the 70% implied probability odds range, which means there's no upside in betting that. The only prop that I would consider would be Nurmagomedov by decision, but the odds are kind of terrible, and so I wouldn't bother with that either. So I hope you found that useful. Let's move on to a more interesting fight. Now let's break down the fight between Jailton Almeida and Alexander Volkov. So if we start off by taking a look at the odds, we can see that Almeida is a 1.50 favourite, which is going to be minus 202 for an implied probability of 67%. And if we take a look at the odds on Volkov, he's around about a 2.58 underdog, which is going to be plus 158 for an implied probability of 38.8%. So let's dive right into the fighter comparison on this one. Even though both these guys are roughly the same age, there is a big difference in terms of miles on the clock, and we can see Volkov has had 49 pro fights, which is a massive amount of fights. He's been in a lot of wars, he's taken a lot of damage, has a lot of wear and tear on the body. Almeida's had a lot of fights too at 25 pro fights, but they've been against a much lower level of opponent, and he obviously hasn't taken anywhere near as much damage as Volkov in his career. We can see Volkov is 4 inches taller with a 1 inch reach advantage and a 4 inch leg reach advantage. So this height and the both reach advantages do compound together to give Volkov a nice size advantage, although there are some downsides to this kind of size advantage, which we will get into in a little bit. In terms of the stats comparison, we can see that Volkov lands 90% more strikes per minute than Almeida, which does give Volkov quite a big advantage on the feet. He is more of a volume striker for a heavyweight. He might not have the raw power that Almeida has, but Volkov does push a very high pace. He does have very good cardio, and averaging almost 5 strikes per minute for a heavyweight is fantastic. That is well above average and definitely gives Volkov the edge on the feet. We can see Almeida is a decent amount more in terms of accurate, but he doesn't throw anywhere near as much. Defensively, Volkov is actually a little bit better, which is a bit of a surprise. I'm guessing it's because obviously he's got that length, which makes it harder for his opponents to get inside and land. No surprise that Almeida is far more aggressive with pursuing takedowns, and we can see he lands an average of 6.58 takedown attempts per 15 minutes, which is very, very high. That's over 2 per round. Volkov has slightly better takedown defense, although Volkov's takedown defense, to be honest with you, isn't great. 72% is a bit misleading. If you do get in deep on the legs of Volkov, he is quite easy to take down, and again, just like the takedown attempts per 15 minutes, no surprise to see Almeida attempting a lot more submissions on the ground as well. In terms of strike distribution, Almeida very much head hunts. The vast majority of strikes he throws are to the head, whereas Volkov has that length and he uses his long kicking game similar to Cyril Gane to chip away at the legs and bodies from a safe distance with those long rangey kicks. So this fight is really going to come down to how smart Jailton Almeida fights, because in some of his recent matchups, he has demonstrated some pretty bad fight IQ, and if he screws around in this matchup, he can definitely get himself into a lot of trouble. This is one of those fights which is a good stylistic matchup for Almeida, but he's going to need to be smart, because if he's not, Volkov does possess the skills to make him pay, and Volkov is the exact kind of guy that can make life very difficult for Almeida. So when we were going through the fighter comparison tool, we were talking about how, you know, there was this compounding effect of Volkov having all these kind of small reach and height advantages. But one of the downsides to being abnormally long and tall for your division is that usually you're quite weak in the lower body, and usually a fighter's takedown defense isn't the best with the long, lanky, lean body type that Volkov has got. And Volkov's no different. Even though his takedown defense stat shows 72%, which is very impressive, the reason why it's that high is because a lot of takedowns throughout Volkov's career have contributed towards this stat, where his opponents haven't really committed that hard to the takedown or tried that hard to take him down. If you do actually fully commit to taking Volkov down, he's pretty easy to get down, and Almeida is a good offensive wrestler with good takedown entries. So generally speaking, if you shoot in deep on the legs and hips of Volkov, you'll get him down pretty easily, and Almeida absolutely has the offensive wrestling to get Volkov to the ground. Now, another characteristic of guys that are abnormally long and tall for their divisions is that they're often quite weak on their back, and this is exactly the case with with Volkov. If you put Volkov on his back, he's very easy to hold down and control. Doesn't do a particularly good job of getting back up to his feet, and at 36 years old, after 49 pro fights, I wouldn't expect him to be improving in that area. Volkov isn't really at that stage in his career where we're going to see any dramatic changes in his capabilities. It's not impossible, but at the same time it's also not likely. So this is a very easy fight for Almeida if he uses a grappling heavy game plan to take Volkov down and control him on the ground. But GSP famously said that fighting was 90% mental, and decision making, fight IQ, game planning and strategy are quite often the difference between winning and losing. And in some of Almeida's recent fights, I feel he's made really poor decisions, which has certainly got him into trouble against Curtis Blades, but against Sergey Spivak and Derek Lewis, while he was still able to get the win, I feel he made a lot of mistakes in those fights that a higher level opponent like Volkov may be able to make him pay for. So if you go back and watch the Sergey Spivak fight, he, looked quite weak on the bottom underneath Spivak, gave up position, just looked very shit on the ground actually against Sergey Spivak. And I don't really rate Spivak's ground game very highly. So, losing position and things like that, getting held down and controlled by Spivak and looking weak off your back against Spivak, it ain't a good look in my opinion. Obviously against Curtis Blades, spent too long on those takedowns up against the cage, ended up getting finished with elbows, just generally spammed takedowns and didn't do it in a smart and safe way and wound up paying the price for it. Also was kind of crazy, you can see here that he shot 13 takedowns in the fight, and the fight only lasted 5.5 minutes. So kind of an absurd statistic to shoot 13 takedowns in just 5.5 minutes. It's kind of crazy. Anything interesting on the granular stats here? Not really. I mean, he did hit 9 of the 13 takedowns, but then, that's not good, because it also shows his grappling control might be a little bit weak. Otherwise, why wouldn't he have had more success holding Blades down? How was Blades able to work his way back up to his feet 9 times? That is kind of crazy. So, yeah, that's one of those situations where against Blades, I feel he could have been a bit smarter, a bit safer, a little bit more tactical with his wrestling game. And then against Derek Lewis, I think he was just guilty of playing with his food, messing around. He had plenty of opportunities to obtain takedowns and get a submission on the ground, but he spent too long fucking around on the feet with Lewis and didn't show that killer instinct in getting the finish on the ground either, even though Derek Lewis was exhausted and struggling to defend himself. But that's a dangerous game to play against a guy like Lewis who hits as hard as Lewis. So I do think Almeida is one of these guys that has questionable fight IQ, and we know Volkov is tough, experienced, and he's the exact kind of guy that can make you pay. if you make mistakes against him. So Volkov is one of these guys that, on the feet should have the advantage against Almeida. He doesn't have the same raw power, but he throws a much higher volume of strikes. And if Almeida doesn't come in with a grappling heavy game plan, get Volkov down, hold him down, I think this one could actually be very, very competitive. Now, from a betting point of view, if I were to bet this fight, I would still take Almeida. I'm not going to bet this fight because I don't like his odds. In order to get any decent margin of value here, you'd have to cap Almeida at like 75%, which is way too high of a price for me to pay personally. But I still favour him to win. And gun to my head, if I really had to bet one of these guys, I would still take Almeida, even though I don't think he's a particularly good bet. So yeah, if you want to bet this fight this weekend, take Almeida, but it is a steep price to pay for a fighter that doesn't have the best fight IQ. Now, in terms of the over-under, I do think it's quite likely this fight will go deep. So we can see that the odds are very much favouring fight to go to a decision. I actually disagree. I actually quite like the over 1.5 rounds on this one. If we take a look at the records of both guys, you can see that Volkov frequently goes over 1.5 rounds. You can see his last 3 fights have gone over 1.5 rounds, and prior to that, he's been to a decision plenty of times against some low-level guys as well, like Greg Hardy. Who else? That's about it, to be fair. He has fought a very high level of opponent. But yes, last 3 fights have gone over 1.5 rounds. If we take a look at Almeida's record, a lot of his fights end inside the distance, but styles make fights. And Volkov is a tough fucker, difficult to put away. So if Almeida does come in with a grappling heavy game plan, it's not going to be easy for Almeida to finish Volkov. And Volkov's more of a volume striker, so it's not going to be the easiest for him to knock Almeida out. He doesn't have too much power. I actually really like the over 1.5 rounds on this fight, and I will be betting it. So in terms of most likely outcomes for the props, let's take a look at most likely outcomes for the props. Almeida by decision is the only one I would consider. Where are you? Almeida by decision. The odds are actually decent, 4.5 plus 350. So yeah, if you want to sprinkle a little bit of money on this fight to make watching it more interesting, I would go Almeida by decision, 3.0 plus 250. And I hope you found that breakdown useful. Every once in a while, a fight comes along where the odds make absolutely no sense to me. This doesn't happen very often. Maybe only a handful of times each year at this point. It used to happen a lot more often, but odds are getting more and more accurate on the UFC every year. But still, from time to time, we run into a fight where the odds, for me personally, are just not based on reality. So I assumed that Rakic would be a pretty big favourite in this fight. So to see him as a slight underdog against Azamat Murzakanov is a pretty big surprise. Now, I often do feel like this, but then when I research the matchup and refresh my memory on the strengths and weaknesses of both fighters, I'll quite often end up agreeing with the odds, or at the very least understanding why the odds are the way they are. And I perhaps would have been overconfident on a fighter and misread it, and then the research process is important because it helps you see what is true. But there are certain fights, like I say, handful of times a year, where you glance at the odds, they seem utterly crazy, and then you research the fight and it reaffirms everything that you thought about the matchup, and it just reaffirms your perception of how the two fighters match up. This is a really good stylistic matchup for Rakic, and I think he beats Murzakanov a very high percentage of the time. If you were to ask me before we get into how they match up from a stylistic point of view, why I think the odds are so inaccurate, the only thing I can really think of after watching all the recent fights from both of them is, obviously, most people betting this sport don't actually do proper fight research. They'll kind of just wiki cap and work from hazy memories and work off win and loss records. And if you look at Murzakanov's record, he's obviously 15-0. He's undefeated. He's never lost, and wiki cappers love that sort of shit. And then if you look at Alexander Rakic, he's on a 3-fight losing streak. And so I think this is one of those situations where the MMA records of both fighters have heavily influenced the odds without people actually taking time to watch a bit of footage on both guys and consider how they both match up from a stylistic point of view. Because win or lose this weekend, the value on Alexander Rakic is absolutely fantastic, and I'm hoping he can come through for us alongside Mackenzie Dern, and hopefully that'll enable you guys doing a bit of extra cash. So let's jump into it. Let's talk about the odds. And let's go through the fighter comparison where we can start to see the reasons why Rakic is such a good bet here. So he's a 1.93 underdog, which is going to be minus 108 for an implied probability of 52%. If we take a look at the odds on Murzakanov, he's a 1.88 favourite, which is going to be minus 114 for an implied probability of 53%. So switching over to the fighter comparison, we can see that Rakic is a bit younger than Murzakanov, although, you know, for a light heavyweight, 36 years old isn't particularly old. But this is where we get into the compounding effect and lots of small to moderate advantages for Rakic that when you add them all together and start to compound them, start to turn into a pretty substantial advantage. So even though 36 years old isn't particularly old for a light heavyweight, Rakic is absolutely in his prime at 33, so 3 years younger. It's a tiny advantage. It's a small advantage. It is something, not a big one, but small. You'll see where I'm going with this. Just hang in there. He is 6 inches taller, though, and this is a big advantage. When we were talking about the fight between Alexander Volkov and Jailton Almeida, we were talking about how, you know, being abnormally long and tall for the division can be a disadvantage in grappling positions. But Rakic isn't abnormally long and tall. He has a big height advantage because Murzakanov is very small for the division. At 5'10" with a 71-inch reach, Murzakanov actually has the wingspan of a lightweight. This guy should probably be fighting in the lightweight division. Clearly he doesn't like to cut weight though, so he finds himself in the light heavyweight division. And so Rakic is going to have an absolutely huge size advantage on Saturday night. Definitely pay attention to the weigh-ins on Friday, because when these two face off, I would imagine Rakic will tower over Murzakanov. The size difference in this one should be massive. So he is 6 inches taller. On top of that, he's got a 7-inch reach advantage and a 5-inch leg reach advantage. So think about this, guys. Not only is Rakic a little bit younger than Murzakanov, but he's a lot taller. He is, you know, got a much longer reach and a much longer leg reach. So if we just go through the statistical advantages for each of these. So fighters with a 7-inch reach advantage win around 67% of the time. We don't have stats for leg reach advantages, but I would imagine it's in the same ballpark as the standard arm reach advantages. And so when you look at those little advantages, height, reach, leg reach, they all start to compound. Now, Murzakanov is a southpaw. We've all heard of the lefty advantage. Another statistic for you is southpaw fighters beat orthodox stance fighters around 70% of the time, so that's definitely an edge for Murzakanov. But then when we get into the stats, we can see statistically the stats kind of edge Murzakanov a little bit. He lands 18.5% more strikes per minute, slightly more accurate with slightly better defense. However, Rakic has fought a much higher level of opponent than Murzakanov. So if we take a look at their records in the UFC, Murzakanov has fought Nchukwi, Devin Clark, Dustin Jacoby, Alonzo Menefield and Brenson Ribeiro. Compare that to Rakic, who's fought 3 world champions in his last 3 fights in Ankalaev, Prohaska, Blachowicz. Then you got Thiago Santos, title challenger, Anthony Smith, title challenger, Volkan Oezdemir, Jimmy Manuwa, Devin Clark, Justin Ledet, Francimar Barroso. So far higher level of opponents. So you'd expect statistically Rakic's numbers to be not quite as good, because it's far harder to land accurately and defend yourself against guys that are the best in the world compared to the guys that Murzakanov has been facing. So statistically all the numbers favour Murzakanov. And then in terms of strike distribution, you can see Murzakanov has that big knockout power. He heavily targets the head, whereas Rakic has a nice even distribution where, you know, he spreads his strikes out and attacks the legs and the body. Now, what you will notice about the anatomical strike distribution heat map for Rakic in particular is he lands an above average number of strikes to the legs. Landing 20% of his strikes to the legs is very high. That would be in the top 5 percentile in the UFC. And Rakic is one of those guys that inflicts a lot of damage to the legs, continually targets the legs, which obviously disrupts the mobility of his opponents and makes it difficult for them to settle into a rhythm. Compare that to Murzakanov, that lands just 3% of his strikes to the legs. And you can start to see another advantage building here for Rakic. Consider this. We know that Rakic has that long frame. He's very rangy. He uses his length well. And he's got a 6-inch height advantage, a 7-inch reach advantage, and a 5-inch leg reach advantage. These just compound to enable Rakic to make the most of his style. Because with Murzakanov being so much smaller and predominantly fighting from the boxing stance, Rakic has got the length to chip away at Murzakanov's legs from a range where Murzakanov is really going to have to get very aggressive to come forward and look to fire back. I think what you're going to see a lot of from Rakic in this fight is him staying all the way outside the range where Murzakanov can land and just hammering Murzakanov's legs over and over again. And Murzakanov isn't the lightest on his feet, does stand a little bit flat-footed, does stand a little bit square. I think Rakic is going to cause Murzakanov huge trouble in this fight with his leg kicks. And this strike distribution heat map is the secret little clue to where Rakic can find a huge edge in this fight when it comes to striking. Now, before we get into talking about specifically how they match up in terms of striking and grappling, we need to cover the biggest reason of all why Rakic is a great bet in this fight. And the reason is Murzakanov's cardio is very bad, whereas Rakic's cardio is very good. So if you go back and you watch any of Murzakanov's fights in the UFC, you'll notice that around about the 6 or 7 minute mark, he becomes very tired and very, very sloppy. So what we're going to do to highlight that for you is we're going to play a little bit of footage so you can see for yourself just how tired, just how sloppy this guy gets. So we're going to start by taking a look at Murzakanov's win against Alonzo Menifield. Obviously there's no point in watching the Brendan Ribeiro fight because the fight ended in just 3 minutes 25 seconds. But even though this fight against Menifield only lasted around 8 minutes, there was still time for Murzakanov to get pretty damn tired. Now obviously evaluating what a fighter's cardio is like is pretty nuanced, right? And ultimately how tired a fighter looks throughout a matchup is very much going to be determined by how much energy they exert. So what we're going to do is skim through this first round against Menifield so that you can see that even though Murzakanov was aggressive in this first round, it's not like he exerted tons of energy and should have been as tired as he looked in the second. On top of that, what I want you to pay attention to is just how much more aggressive and how much higher Murzakanov's volume is in round 1 compared to round 2. Because a trend that I noticed with Murzakanov is that in the first round of his fights, he comes out the gate all guns blazing, throwing a high volume strikes, looking to kill everyone in round 1. But then as the fight progresses, he becomes not only progressively less aggressive, and his volume falls off a cliff, but less dangerous as well. You won't notice that on paper because he's got a second round finish here and 2 third round finishes here. But I think this says more about Tafon and Chakwi and Devin Clark and their limitations and weaknesses than it does about Murzakanov's strengths as a fighter. So what we will do, we're gonna try and keep this breakdown video as short as possible. So I'm not gonna play the whole thing, but we'll just skip through. And what I want you to do is pay attention to how fast, how light on his feet Murzakanov is in round 1, kind of like his aggression levels, his volume, and above all else what I want you to do is keep a close eye on how much energy he's exerting. So we're about, if we just skip slightly ahead, we're about 2 minutes in, and you can see up until this point in the fight it's been relatively slow paced. Now he starts to get aggressive, so now he starts to come forward, put a lot of pressure on Menifield and look to take him out. And he does this in his fights. He tends to fight in waves. So he will come forward very aggressively, and look to kill you like this, and then if he doesn't get the job done, he'll ease off, catch his breath and recharge his batteries. But into the second and third round, he kind of stops blitzing just because he doesn't really have the energy to go like that for too long. So you see him again here in round 1, super aggressive, throwing a high volume of strikes, looking to take Menifield out. Very, very aggressive. Good in the pocket, but again, you've got to remember Rakic has that huge size and reach advantage and doesn't really fight in the pocket. He uses his length well. So we're skipping through. And that's pretty much how round 1 went. So you can get like a rough idea of how the first round went. Obviously, you can go watch it by yourself in its entirety if you want to. But the first round, don't get me wrong, it was contested at a decent pace. Murzakanov was definitely aggressive in that first round. But you'll see a very different Murzakanov in round 2. Nowhere near as aggressive, nowhere near as much volume, nowhere near as many of those blitzing attacks. So what we're going to do, we're just going to skip ahead. We're a minute in here now, nothing major's happening. We're going to go another 30 seconds in. And we're going to go to about here, right? So this is a minute and 10 seconds into round 2. And you've just seen in the first round how aggressive he is, how high volume he is. We've skipped through the first minute of this round, but you could probably tell from skipping through that we didn't really have much aggression from Murzakanov in the first minute of round 2. And as I hit play here, you'll see that now he's much more on the back foot. Against Menifield in the first round, he was coming forward aggressively, he was on the front foot, he was throwing a high volume of strikes. Here he's kind of standing back a bit, becoming more flat-footed. But above all else, pay close attention to his body language, because we're only 6.5 minutes into a 15-minute fight here. We're not even at the halfway mark yet. But just look at his body language. Remember in the first round, the very beginning of the first round, he's light on his feet and he's bouncing in and out and he's throwing those nice fast combinations. Look at how much more flat-footed he is here. Notice how much more flat-footed he is. Notice how much lower his hands are, and notice that his mouth is open wide. So this body language, just 6.5 minutes into the fight, is very different from his body language in the first round. Yes, his boxing is still sharp, but instead of him being bouncing around light on his feet, he's kind of flat-footed and starting to look pretty sloppy. And again, we're not even at the halfway mark yet. Yes, he's still got power. You know, he hits very hard, but his mouth is open wide, his hands are down low. He's looking much sloppier in these exchanges. I mean, look how flat-footed he is here, guys. The camera's panned out. Poor timing. But much more flat-footed, much sloppier, and doesn't look anywhere near as dangerous with his hands either. His hand speed is definitely dipping. So, again, we're not even at the midway point, and you can see signs here that Murzakanov is slowing, and we're seeing a bit of a momentum swing in Menifield's favour. Don't get me wrong, Menifield's still getting outstruck. He's taking a lot of damage. Menifield is losing this fight, but you can see the Murzakanov's output, his volume is waning, and he's becoming tired. And just at the point where we get that momentum swing in Menifield's favour, and you think, you know, Murzakanov might be going on to struggle a little bit here, like he did against Tafon and Chukwi, we can see that Murzakanov, we just skip ahead, back in the middle of the octagon, right? Look at this body language. So failed judo throw on an outside trip. Look, hands down low. Look, his hands are getting lower and lower. Hands are getting lower and lower. Output has dropped. He's not throwing much anymore. Barely any volume compared to round 1. And there's still 2 minutes left to go in round 2. Hands down low. No volume. And then he just lands a big shot that hurts Menifield and puts him out. Kind of what happened in the Nchukwi fight. So that's just one fight. Obviously, we don't want to form a strong opinion and place a bet based off one fight. We want more evidence than that. So let's take a look at the Dustin Jacoby fight. So let's make sure we are at the beginning. So again, I don't want to make this breakdown super long, but I just want you to notice the patterns and understand the reasoning for the bet on Rakic. So if we hit play, again, look at the difference now in the way Murzakanov moves in this first round compared to how he moved in that second round against Menifield. Look how light on his feet he is. He's in and out. His hands are up high. Look how high up his left hand is here. Left hand up protecting the chin. And remember against Menifield, just a minute into round 2, his hands were down here. You know, very, very low. And he's in and he's out and he's light on his feet. Like bouncing around. And we don't want to make this breakdown super long. But this is just an illustration of how much Murzakanov slows around about that 6 or 7 minute mark. So we're going to skip through. Again, he's light on his feet around about the midway point through round 1. But as we skip through, you can see it's not like this first round was contested at a super high pace or anything like that. So we've made the statement that Murzakanov slows down around about the 6 or 7 minute mark. So we're at the 6 minute mark now. In round 2, we're a minute in. So notice how much more flat-footed he is here after just 6 minutes, right? He's still a little light on his feet, but if we go ahead another minute, right? This is another minute here, and they're in the clinch. If we go just to when they separate from the clinch, okay, 2 minutes left to go into round 2. Look at how different Murzakanov is now, right? Flat-footed. Look how flat-footed he is, right? Flat-footed. And you can see he's not as aggressive. He's kind of coming forward. He's walking Jacoby down for sure. But he doesn't have the same volume. He's not as aggressive. His hands are dropping. He's flat-footed. Even when you can see Jacoby jabbing him and chipping away at him, he's not trying to counter. Look how flat-footed he is here, guys. And there's a minute left to go in round 2. He's bouncing up and down, but that's not footwork to set up strikes. That's just bouncing around on the spot, trying to recharge his batteries. You know, in the final 2 minutes of this round, he's barely thrown anything. I think he's thrown 2 or 3 punches in the last minute. And you can see, look how tired he is here. Now, what we're going to do is skip into the 3rd round. And we'll go just a minute into round 3 because he's had a minute to recover in between rounds. And you can see flat-footed, low volume, very, very low volume. And just eating jabs from Jacoby. So this is the stage in the fight which really sells me on a bet for Rakic. Because we know Rakic is a long-rangey striker that does a good job of using his length and likes to chip away at you with jabs and leg kicks. And look how much success Jacoby has here, using his length to chip away at Murzakanov with jabs and with leg kicks. But from my perspective, Rakic is a far better striker than Jacoby. And you can see Jacoby is just stinging Murzakanov here. Murzakanov's volume has dropped. He's flat-footed. He's slow. He's not countering. And he's just getting picked apart. And look at how heavy he stood on that lead leg. Remember we said about Rakic having amazing leg kicks, throwing a high volume of leg kicks. Imagine what's going to start to happen when Rakic starts to hammer that lead leg of Murzakanov. And you can see Murzakanov just backing up here, circling away, trying to find space for himself and time in there to recover. Barely throwing anything in this 3rd round. And you can see Jacoby just chipping away at him with volume. Chipping away, chipping away, chipping away. And even when Murzakanov does come forward and let his hands go, there's no real power in his hands anymore. In round 1, big power. Very dangerous. Look at that. Threw a big shot and missed. And then look, hands down by his side. Big visible deep breath. Look at this. Exhausted. Now imagine Rakic being in there with him, hammering his legs, peppering the body with those deep kicks, pumping the jab. Murzakanov tries a single leg, doesn't get it, doesn't have the energy to get it. Jacoby easily stuffs the double leg. And you can see it's actually Jacoby in the end that takes him down just because he's got more energy. So, you know, we can look at what we can quickly do. I really don't want this breakdown video to be super long, but what we can quickly do is we can quickly go to the midway point of round 2 of the Devin Clark fight, just so you can see his body language. So again here, minute and 10 left to go in round 2. Again, flat-footed. Oh, actually, we'll show you round 1 so you can see he's like, yeah, there you go, light on his feet, bouncing around. Light on his feet, bouncing around. Look how light on his feet he is. He's like a different guy in the second round. Hits hard, he's aggressive, he stays on Devin. Volume much higher. Right? And then we go into round 2, midway through round 2. Obviously, they're in the clinch, so we need to skip through the clinch work and the ground work. There we go. When they're back up, look how much more flat-footed he is. I bet you he doesn't throw much in the final minute of this round. I can't remember. I researched this fight on Monday. It was 4 or 5 days ago now. But I bet you he doesn't throw much in this final minute. Because he doesn't. Past the first round, he doesn't really throw very much. Which is why it's a little bit... The MMA record of Murzakanov is misleading. When you see him have these second and third round finishes, it's misleading because he's really not that dangerous in the second and third round, but he has these anomalous outcomes like the flash KO of Nchukwi being a really good example, when Nchukwi was really swinging momentum in his favour. You know, Menafield swinging momentum in his favour. So yeah, you can see there, barely landed anything in the final minute. If we then go into round 3, again, flat-footed. And again, can you see how later in the fight, when Murzakanov is coming forward on the front foot, he's very accurate, he's good at landing. But when he's fighting at distance, he's nowhere near as accurate. Okay, it's over. Alright, and then one more. We're going to do one more here. We're going to go to the Tafon and Nchukwi fight. And if you do like the convenience of having the ability to pull up fighters' past fights just by going to our UFC Research Tool and go into an MMA fighter's record, and you've got, you know, multiple sources to watch their past fights, give it a try. Link in the description below. So again, in this first round against Nchukwi, you can see light on his feet, bouncing around. And then we're going to go into round 2. We don't want to make this breakdown super long. Midway point of round 2, still light on his feet. But what you'll see from Murzakanov towards the end of this second round is very tired body language. You see a bit of it here. Hands down by his side, mouth open wide. You'll see him take a big visible deep breath now. There you go, hands down by his side, big visible deep breath. He bounces around similar to what you saw in the Jacoby fight. But if we go back to the centre of the octagon, you'll see very low volume. He's just trying to back up. Look how low his hands are because he hasn't got the energy to keep them up. Minute and 30 left to go. And we'll just, you can see how tired, how sloppy he is. I mean, look how slow his hand speed is there. Very slow hand speed. Look how low his hands are. And this is in the second round, guys. This is in the second round against Tafon and Nchukwi. So anyway, we'll be done there because I don't want to drag this breakdown video out. I think I've made my point. So the reason why I think Rakic is a great bet in this fight is because he has so many advantages that when you add them all up, the fact that you can bet him at an implied probability of just 52%, it's kind of absurd. I think these odds are great value. We'll go through it and recap. He's younger. He's taller. He's got a reach and a leg reach advantage. That size advantage, height, reach, leg reach, it all compounds. On top of that, he has much better cardio. He does a really good job of attacking the legs, and as you can see from how flat-footed and stationary Murzakanov is, he's going to be very susceptible to the leg kicks. On top of that, Rakic has the takedown defense to keep this fight standing, and he does a great job of using his length. So if Murzakanov doesn't knock Rakic out in round 1, it is very likely that Rakic just leg kicks and jabs him to death in round 2 and 3 when Murzakanov's output and volume falls off a cliff. And what we've also seen from Rakic in some of his fights over the last few years is an attempt to try and use grappling heavy game plans. We saw him use a grappling heavy game plan to beat Anthony Smith 5 years ago. But the point being, we know Murzakanov is the kind of guy that has a very bad gas tank. So if Rakic comes in, tries to take him down, force him to grapple in the first round, wears on him in the clinch, even if he doesn't have success, What he might do is wear Murzakanov out even faster, to the point where Murzakanov is way more beatable in rounds 2 and 3. So look, the only two things I can think of as why Murzakanov's the favourite here is home advantage, being a Muslim, fighting a non-Muslim in the United Arab Emirates. We've already spoken about how big of an advantage that is in the study that I did. As you can read here, if you come to the site, go to Nurmagomedov's breakdown. Yeah, this is a great fight for Rakic. He's a great bet, and I'm really hoping that Rakic and Dern come through for us this weekend. So we'll have a quick look at the over-under and the props. I do think the most likely outcome here is Rakic by knockout or TKO in the 3rd round. You can see my official prediction here. I think Rakic is going to get the job done by knockout or TKO in round 3. When you see my confidence level, got a tooltip here that is relating to my pick on the fighter, not the whole pick. This is not me 8 out of 10 confident that Rakic is going to win by knockout TKO in round 3. It's just me 8 out of 10 confidence level that Rakic is going to win. I think that the 2 out of 10 is if Rakic gets flash KO'd in the 1st round, which could definitely happen because Murzakanov is a pretty dangerous striker. But if we take a look at the over-under, I think it's more likely the fight doesn't go to a decision, because I think what's going to happen is you're either going to get Murzakanov knock Rakic out in round 1, or you'll see Rakic get a late stoppage when Murzakanov becomes too tired to defend himself. And then the props that I really like on this one, I really like Rakic to win in round 3. The odds are around 14.0 plus 1,300. Obviously, it's not super likely to hit, but you don't need to win a super high volume of those bets over the long term to make a really good profit. I think that's a good bet. I think it's very likely to win relative to these kind of bets and how often they win. I think this is one of the better ones, because I think Murzakanov's tough enough to hang in there for a couple rounds, but if he gets tired and those leg kicks start adding up, I think Murzakanov can find himself in a lot of trouble in round 2 and in round 3 especially. So I like Rakic a lot in this fight. I also like Dern a lot in this fight. I really hope they come through for us this weekend. Guys, come through for me this weekend. Show some support. Join the live betting group. Join the community. Come play around with this research tool and let me know what you think about it in the comments below. We're going to make money again this weekend. We make money most weeks, and it's going to be amazing. So like and subscribe if you haven't already. Have a great weekend. Hope Dern and Rakic help make your weekend a bit better, and hopefully I'll be back next week with another breakdown video. Check out my website, links in the description below. Join the community, you won't regret it. Love to have you on the team as part of the family. Take care everyone, love you all. Nice one guys, bye.